Hi, everybody. Welcome to class. I hope you did well on your midterm. Today, I'm going to start talking about the Renaissance and the Reformation, which is a very important time in history. We're going to see several videos that will support the lecture and help clarify some of the ideas. Now, there's a couple things that I want to say to you. If by chance you have not taken your midterm, it's time to do it, all right? We did not close the portal, so this way you have a little extra time to do it. If you are experiencing any problem, you need to contact the school and we'll walk you through the steps to take your midterm. In addition, all right, you must click complete at the end of taking the test. Otherwise, the test does not recognize that it's been completed, all right? So just a couple little reminders. Now today's a real sunny day and it is beautiful outside. And we're going to talk about the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a French word which means rebirth. The reason why I bring up weather is spring is like a renaissance. It's a rebirth of plants growing, trees getting leaves, the weather turning nice, the grass sprouting. So let's think about the Renaissance like the springtime. It was covered between the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe. And it was a period known as the development of culture and the arts. And it spread across Europe very rapidly. And it started at the end of the Middle Ages. And remember, we talked about the Middle Ages weren't just the time where it was dark and nothing happened, but the Renaissance really picked up on this rebirth of architecture and art and the arts, okay? And it started in Florence, Italy. So many people were wealthy at this time. And what did they do with their wealth? They used their wealth to commission artists to do paintings and sculptures. And it was a time of philosophical ideas, of thought, okay? We talked about philosophers before, about Plato and Aristotle. And the influence of the wealthy was done by one particular family. There were many who participated, but the Medicis. The Medicis were very influential and very rich. And so they did a great push during the Renaissance to increase the arts and the awareness of the arts. And so when we talk about art during this time, we talk about certain factors. One of the factors is humanism. Now let's think about humanism. What does it sound like? It sounds like human or people, right? During this period of time, the art depicts or shows people as they really are. Now, you know, when you did the art class last semester, we looked at different types of art. And, you know, some of it was very clunky and some of it was Egyptian art. Their bodies were going one way and their heads were going another way. And then slowly it starts to develop. And we also talked about this year when we were talking about the Adriatic art and looking at their vases, we saw in that civilization that they were very good at depicting how people looked for real. So in medieval times, things were focused on the spiritual. During the Renaissance, they're focused on the human, that people are the things that determine what happened. In medieval times and times in the past, religion was the center of what was happening. And this school explored many different things, such as grammar, history, philosophy, poetry, and classical values. And what was the big difference? It opened things like architecture and the arts and that world of elitists to everyday people. Before, people who were poor or servants or who were the lower class really didn't enjoy the arts and the literature. But during the Renaissance, it was more available to everyone. And humanists placed a certain value on personal power, and that the person was the heart of everything. And there was a great resurgence, a rebirth, okay, again, a renaissance in Greek and Latin literature. And remember when we talked about Greece, I talked to you about Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. They were philosophers. So people are starting to look at their writings again, all right, and follow them, and they're becoming even more well-known. Petrarch is a well-known father of the Renaissance, and he was the leading figure that united everybody in the humanist movement. And his belief was that humans are given power by God. Well, we can't get any better power, right? If God gives it to you, it must be right. And so the Medici family had a lot of influences on the economy, on politics, on what went on in society and what went on in the art world. And they were patrons of the arts, commissioning many, many different things to be made. And because they had this money and this influence, they were very powerful in Florence. So let's look at some other issues with the Renaissance. Number one is naturalism. And remember, I talked to you about, at this point, they're going to start looking at the human form as it appears. People are actually studying the human body to make sure that when you're running, the legs show a certain way, the head moves a certain way, the body is stretched in a way. In fact, during that time, several artists would go to the morgue. And Leonardo da Vinci, who you know is a famous artist, used to go to the morgue to examine and sketch the bodies, the nude bodies of people, to see how the skeletal structure worked and how the tissues were over it and how it all came together, what the muscles look like. And you can always see, there's a picture that he's very well known for, where it's a man and it starts and his arms are in different positions like this, and it shows how the arms look and how the legs and the body looks. So they were really naturalistic at that part. Contrapposto is a painting technique at that time that was used to increase realism. So what does that mean? It was the use of darks and lights in a painting to show contrast and depth. Now let's look at my neck, okay? So if somebody's painting my neck over here, because it's a little hollow here, they will use a darker skin tone here to make it seem like it's in more, and lighter here because the light is hitting here. And in that case, you're getting a real three-dimensional look. Contrapposto, all right? And it also creates what we call perspective, depth. Everything doesn't seem like it's on the same plane. When you look at this, you see that the chair is behind me and further behind that is the TV. If we did not do it in perspective and lights and darks, right, this chair here, you see along the side, it's darker. So that's going down. And we see the top kind of goes up like this because it's reflecting the light. They learn to use that light to make their contrasts. And it also talked about Chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro is also the light and depth. And one-point perspective was a way of giving perspective to architecture and when you were drawing it. Now let me see if I can find, we're going to look at a video called Italian Renaissance, okay? in 7 minutes, right? So I'm going to share my screen with you.
Hey everybody, it's the History Teacher. This episode looks at the Italian Renaissance. Renaissance is a French word which means rebirth. The Renaissance was an intellectual, cultural, and artistic flourishing that occurred first in Italy between about 1300 and 1550. The Renaissance emphasized new learning and artistic expressions, and the rediscovery of knowledge and perspective from ancient Greece and Rome. Italian city-states such as Venice, Milan, Padua, Pisa, and especially Florence were the core of many Renaissance developments. It should be noted, though, that the impact of the Renaissance was limited to a small portion of the population, the rich elite. For everyone else, their lives continued unaffected by any advancements of the Renaissance. The main themes of the Renaissance were humanism, individualism, and virtue. Humanism refers to the reading and understanding of writings and ideals of ancient Greece and Rome before the spread of Christianity. Renaissance scholars observe that because ancient Greece and Rome were pre-Christian, they were not God-centered, like medieval Europe was, but people-centered. That's the essence of humanism. Individualism refers to the emphasis on individual expression, individual value, and individual action, as opposed to emphasizing group or community behavior, which was the main medieval perspective. Renaissance individualism valued great accomplishments and looked for heroes in history. Virtue, spelled V-I-R-T-U, no E at the end, refers to people working to realize their full human potential through the cultivation of their abilities. These abilities could be in art, speech, politics, and warfare, for example. Someone trying to maximize her or his potential would be pursuing Renaissance virtue. So what caused the Renaissance? Several origins can be identified. First, Italian economic growth. Northern Italy was very wealthy because it served as a trading hub between the silk and spice producing east and the consuming west of England, France, and Germany. Also, Italian merchants had built great wealth in the cloth industry and developed international banks. This wealth gave the upper class leisure to produce new ideas and the money to support the artists and scholars who produced new works. A second cause was political. Struggles between the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and merchants during the Middle Ages had resulted in the independence of many small city-states in northern Italy. The governments of these city-states, often controlled by one man, competed for prestige by supporting artists and scholars. A third cause was that northern Italian city-states were often built on the ruins of ancient Roman ones, and the citizens knew of their heritage. It was easy to become interested in the ancient past when the ruins of a great civilization were scattered about. A fourth cause was the arrival in Italy of people who were fleeing the falling Byzantine Empire. These people brought with them new ideas, including the study of Greek, knowledge of which had been forgotten outside of Greece. Therefore, no ancient Greek texts could be understood. Humanist writers were inspired by and imitated works of the classical past, meaning ancient Greece and Rome. Classical literature was more secular, that is, non-religious, and wide-ranging than that of the Middle Ages. The first truly Renaissance writer was Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374. He wrote in both Latin and Italian, promoted the study of ancient Rome, collected and preserved work of ancient writers, and produced much work in the classical literary style. He's best known for his sonnets, including many expressing his love for a married woman named Laura, and is considered the father of humanism. Boccaccio, who lived from 1313 to 1375, wrote the Decameron, a collection of short stories. It was written in Italian rather than in Latin, and was meant to entertain the reader rather than offer religious lessons. Both of these features deviated from the medieval norm. Castiglione, who lived from 1478 to 1429, authored the Book of the Courtier, which specified the qualities necessary for a Renaissance gentleman. Abilities in conversation, sports, arms, dance, music, Latin, and Greek, he advised, should be combined with an agreeable personal demeanor. The book was translated into many languages and greatly influenced Western ideas about correct education and behavior. Artists also broke with the medieval past in both technique and content. Renaissance art also used religious topics, but often dealt with non-religious themes or portraits of individuals. Oil paints, new techniques of light and shadow, and linear perspectives produced works of energy which appeared to have 3 dimensions, not just 2. By copying classical models and using freestanding pieces, Renaissance sculptors produced works celebrating the individualistic and non-religious spirit of the day. Renaissance architects openly copied ancient Roman forms, such as the rounded arch and squared angles, when constructing towns and country houses for the rich and urban buildings for the cities. Several artists became associated with the new style of art. Giotto, who lived from 1266 to 1336, painted religious scenes using a technique called chiaroscuro to create an illusion of depth and greater realism using light and shadow. He's considered the father of Renaissance painting. Donatello, who lived from 1386 to 1466, the father of Renaissance sculpture, produced in his David the first statue cast in bronze since classical times. Masaccio emphasized naturalism in his painting Expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden by showing realistic, nude human figures with 3 dimensions expressing emotion. Leonardo da Vinci produced numerous works, including The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, as well as many mechanical designs, although few were ever constructed. Raphael, a master of Renaissance grace and style, theory and technique, represented these skills in his work called The School of Athens. Michelangelo, who lived from 1475 to 1560, was, like Leonardo, a universal man. He produced masterpieces in architecture, sculpture, and in painting, like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, for example. His work was a bridge to a new, non-Renaissance style called Mannerism. Renaissance scholars were more pragmatic and secular than medieval ones. Instead of focusing on God, they focused on people and on solving practical problems. Also, scholars participated in the lives of their cities as active politicians. Leonardo Bruni, who lived from 1370 to 1444, was a civic humanist. He served as Chancellor of Florence, where he used his rhetorical skill to rouse its citizens against external enemies. He also wrote a history of his city and was the first to use the term humanism. Niccolò Machiavelli, who lived from 1469 to 1527, wrote his book The Prince, which analyzed politics from the standpoint of reason rather than faith or tradition. His work describes how a political leader could obtain and hold power by acting only in his self-interest and regardless of morality. At the time, the effects of the Renaissance were originally confined to a small number of rich and powerful people. But over the centuries, Renaissance notions of individualism, human dignity, and human potential have influenced the whole world. All right, that's it for now. Thank you for watching and see you next time.
Okay, so that gave you a good picture of some of the things that I spoke about, but also a very big picture of the different artists during that time. And you know the names of many of them. Do I expect you to remember all of them? No. But I do think that you should think about Michelangelo. That is definitely one that you would know about. And also the fact that he really went to great lengths to study the human figure. And you did see that in the painting of the Sistine Chapel, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So you can see the difference in the artwork from the Middle Ages to now in the Renaissance. There seems to be more life, more realism, more focus on the person or the humanistic part of it, okay? Next topic for today is going to be the Protestant Reformation. Now you remember with Constantine I, he was influential on spreading Christianity throughout Europe. And Christianity was very strong for a while. And then a part of Catholicism breaks off Christianity and becomes Protestantism, which is a branch of Christianity. Some of the teachings are different. And a monk and a German teacher named Martin Luther were instrumental in starting this area of the church. And it became the basis of Protestantism and what Protestant beliefs are today. And this Reformation led to a schism. It's a strange word. It's schism. Schism means a break apart, okay? Two parts of Christianity are breaking apart. Some are following Protestantism, some are Catholic, okay? They're very similar in many ways, but there are some different teachings about this. So I want you to take a look at this and see what we can find as far as find out about Protestantism and how that changed as far as going from Catholicism, Catholic religion, to what happens here, all right, and the schism.
There were two orders of heroes. They've been fighting each other
You
for
just have to
centuries.
skip this area.
Like Vin Diesel and The Rock. I think we lost him. Nope, he's very not lost.
Sonic the Hedgehog 2, not yet rated.
The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century shook the very foundation of Europe's cultural identity. The Reformation was a revolution
Look at the
of
words
religion
at the
in
bottom
Western
of
Europe.
the screen.
Essentially, it was
Listen
the
to
result
her
of
reading.
centuries
Look at
worth
the
of
words,
political
too.
and social grievances against the Christian church as it existed. Christianity, which began as a fledgling religion in the 1st century, had grown by the 13th century into an institution powerful enough to rival state governments. For instance, the Pope, then the leader of the Christian church, had greater political and military influence than some emperors and kings. This tension was exacerbated by the transformative social and intellectual period known as the Renaissance. In particular, this period involved the rise of humanism, a philosophy that shifted man's fate from being determined by religious doctrine to being determined by man himself. Additionally, some within the church believed it had become increasingly corrupt. Priests like John Wycliffe of England and Jan Hus of Bohemia challenged the church's teachings, which they believed had strayed away from the Bible. However, one of the most well-known advocates for a reformed Christian church was a German priest named Martin Luther. Martin Luther began to question the church in the early 1500s. He believed it was abusing its power and disagreed with some of its practices. For instance, he challenged the church's doctrine that stated the Pope, not the Bible, was the ultimate spiritual authority. Plus, he criticized the church for selling indulgences, the practice of purchasing forgiveness for one's sins by giving money to the church. Luther believed the church needed to revise its doctrine by returning to the Bible's teachings and by saying that salvation could be granted by faith in Christ alone. So on October 31st, 1517, Luther took a stand. In what's considered the birth of the Protestant Reformation, Luther is said to have nailed 95 theses, or arguments against the church, onto the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther was later put on trial in front of church officials to defend his theses, but in January 1521, the church declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. While Luther's membership with the church ended, the Reformation he argued for started to gain momentum. Unlike Luther's predecessors who challenged the church, Luther had one tool at his disposal that they didn't have: the printing press. This new invention allowed his arguments to be copied and spread across Europe. This unprecedented access to ideas such as Luther's inspired many others to challenge the church, thereby splitting Christianity into two major denominations, Catholic and Protestant, from the word protest. Also, the Bible became more accessible. Luther and other reformists translated biblical text from Latin, which was only known by nobility and church officials, to German, English, and French, languages spoken by the general public. While the Protestant Reformation revolutionized the Christian faith, it had ramifications that extended beyond religion. Prior to the Reformation, many Europeans were dependent on an educated upper class. But perhaps the most resounding impact of the Reformation was that the common people were empowered to question religion and other aspects of life. The Reformation, along with technological innovations and the introduction of other new ideas, gave many in Europe's general public the freedom and power to decide their own fates.
Okay, so we see that Protestantism arises because Martin Luther begins to question, is it right for people, especially rich people, to pay money to the church to forgive their sins? He said that that's not right. God, believing in God and doing good deeds and asking for God's forgiveness is the way to absolve your sin. So, they also talked about the church had become so powerful, all right, that it was more powerful than any of the rulers at the time. And that didn't sit right with Martin Luther either. And so he wanted to say that the main authority for religion was the Holy Bible, and that the Pope was just another cleric person in the church, just higher up. And he didn't have these extra, he didn't have this extra power. Martin Luther had, it was about 500 years ago, he nailed his 95 theses on the door of Catholic Church in Germany. And this listed all of his concerns and complaints about the Catholic Church. As luck would have it, at that time, the printing press was developed. Now remember, we've looked through society all this year, and we know that the first writings were done on clay tablets, and what? That was really hard to store and was really heavy to carry. And then the next writing we saw was hieroglyphics and carvings and papyrus rolls, and only certain people knew how to use those. And it was very expensive to do the papyrus. And there are people who were copying manuscripts that they were done by hand. So it took a long time. And if someone wanted it, it was usually a rich person. So with the invention of the printing press, it was easier to distribute copies of the Bible to other people who wouldn't ordinarily have them or afford them. And to also, duplicate the thoughts and ideas that were starting to become this Protestant Reformation, this uprise of Protestantism. And as I said, Protestantism, protest is in the front. They're protesting against what they saw with some of the things with the Catholic Church. Okay? So this was a very important movement, and mainly people broke away with a schism, and some followed Catholicism, the Catholic Church in the Christianity realm, and some followed Martin Luther, who believed in several other things. There are bases for both religions that are very similar. During this time of the Reformation, we see the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution started modern science that we know today, right? Most of the time, things that happened in science were attributed in ancient times to the will of the gods. We did see development in learning a little bit about astronomy and things like that back with the Egyptians. But during this time, physics, astronomy, biology, and chemistry come into play. Right? And again, remember, the humanistic part of it is, especially with chemistry and biology, learning about people were beginning to study that. There's somebody who I want you to know from this period of the scientific revolution, and that's Galileo. Galileo was a famous astronomer, and he worked towards developing telescopes. And what he did was, he was known as the father of the scientific method, and he found out that if he could work with lenses and lights, that he could cause a magnification, making something further away look bigger and clearer. So his first invention was a refracting telescope, that the magnification was strong enough that when he looked through this refracting telescope, he could look at the moon and see the craters and the mountains on the moon clearly. Before then, people were really just thinking of the moon as one smooth orb, one smooth body up there. But now, Galileo has developed this telescope. So now he's beginning to look up at the stars. Now you have to remember that when you don't know too much about the world outside of where you live, you think that everything revolves around you. And the thought before the scientific revolution was that things revolved around Earth. However, Galileo was able to use his telescope and he was able to see the moons that circled Jupiter. And since they were circling Jupiter, that takes away or dispels the idea that everything in the sky is circling the Earth. Because if that was the case, then the moons wouldn't be going around Jupiter. They would be standing still in one spot, and Jupiter and moons would be circling the Earth. He was able to see many thousands of stars. He was able to see that the Milky Way, the galaxy in which Earth is, was not just stars here and there, but was made of hundreds of thousands of stars, all in one group. All right. So this was very important. And remember, during this time, this goes against the teachings of the church as well. And Galileo is punished many times because of his thoughts. Let's take a look at a video about this. I'm trying, guys. All right. Hold on. I'm looking. Oh. Jake, I did well for 2 times, but I didn't do well now. Can you just get me back to my videos? And I'll do it. I was able to do 2, but then I couldn't get back to where I was supposed to.
Yeah, was my email, so.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Mhm.
All right. That's right. I sent it to your email. Okay, it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm good. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's look at how the scientific revolution changed the world.
Science. It's how we know our place in the universe, how we know what natural
Again,
phenomena
look
are,
at the words
how we know
while
what
I
this
do
thing
this.
was, how we know how to not die at the ripe old age of 36, and how we know how to write complex mathematical equations to determine how a ball rolls down a hill. Because of science, we were able to go from this to this, which is honestly a pretty good thing. In fact, those 2 images were only 500 years apart. So, what happened about 500 years ago that changed the course of our modern world? By the way, this video is part of a huge collaboration between a bunch of YouTube history channels called Project Revolution, hence the intro. Now, most of these people, whose videos you should absolutely check out once you're done with this one, are covering revolutions that birthed new nations and changed other nations forever. And while that is like totally my thing, I decided I'd cover a slightly different kind of revolution. The scientific revolution obviously didn't topple any regimes, at least on its own, nor was it necessarily one single event, but a whole paradigm shift taking place over a couple hundred years. Granted, only intellectuals really knew it would have even been happening at the time, but it's still consequential. Before the scientific revolution, most scientific knowledge in the ancient world, or at least in Europe, was based on the teachings of various Greek and Roman scientists and philosophers, like Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen, who all had one thing in common. They were kind of wrong about everything. Granted, everything they said certainly seemed plausible at the time and was probably the best they could have done, but by the middle of the second millennium AD, it was starting to become clear that they weren't necessarily right about everything they taught. Back then, the scientific method was a long way from being invented, so basically everything that made sense was good enough. Of course, the most well-known instance of this is with Ptolemy's geocentric model of the solar system, which described the Earth as one single giant stationary sphere in the middle of the universe, of which everything else orbited. The other planets, the sun, the stars, everything. This model of the heavens was basically the general model throughout the ancient world, and was actually debunked by many different scientists, but the only one of them people actually seem to have listened to was Nicolaus Copernicus, and his heliocentric model of the solar system. You know, for being right. Well, it was actually full of tiny flaws that made the calculations infeasible, but nothing that couldn't be fixed up by later scientists. That is kind of the basis of science after all, measuring data and improving on work done by others. Copernicus and many other astronomers at the time made many revolutionary discoveries in the field, and they were all rewarded for their contributions to human civilization by being arrested for heresy. The church, all churches, Catholic and Protestant, didn't really like the idea of Earth not being the center of everything, because, I mean, if they were wrong about their place in the universe, what else could they be wrong about? Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, and Copernicus actually got away with it, but only by dying just after his book, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, was published in 1543. Giordano Bruno, of course, also argued that the other stars in the sky were no different from our sun, or, well, relatively speaking, and could thus have their own planets, possibly even with their own life forms. So, arguing that this would mean that humanity wasn't the pinnacle of creation, the church of course burned him at the stake. So, if these early astronomers had such a hard time convincing their peers of this new model, what eventually changed? Basically, overwhelming evidence. After Copernicus published his book, other astronomers discovered more arguments in favor of the heliocentric model. For one, Galileo discovered that Jupiter had at least 4 different moons of its own, at least 4, which orbited it without a care in the universe for whether or not Earth existed. The phases of Venus were also discovered to have had nothing to do with the Earth, but everything to do with the Sun. Eventually, opposition to the heliocentric model started to fade, with heliocentric works finally starting to be unbanned in the church by 1758, as the church's influence was also starting to fade with the Enlightenment. Now, it's pretty easy to confuse the scientific revolution with the Enlightenment, but they are different things. The scientific revolution was a paradigm shift in how we did science, whereas the Enlightenment was more of a philosophical and religious movement that took place a bit later, often touted as an extension of the former. So, even if you don't care much about space, why should you care about all this? Well, first off, why don't you care about space? Second, while the scientific revolution might not have been a revolution in the traditional sense, it did still change how we think about the world. And while this may not have been something initially known about by the common person, the new knowledge brought on by the series of events did eventually come down to the common person. Nowadays, not only do we all know about how the solar system works, no one would even think to keep that knowledge from us. At least, no one whose theories actually work out. It wasn't just math, physics, and astronomy that saw significant advancements during this time though, but things like biology and chemistry, which are both definitely more helpful in the whole not pushing the average lifespan down to 30 department. Speaking of which, The study of human anatomy also expanded from merely the teachings of Galen, who likely never actually dissected a human body. This whole paradigm shift can be seen in the motto of the Royal Society, founded in 1660, Nullius in verba, meaning on the word of no one. If you find through your own research that an old teaching is bad, reject it and replace it with the better finding. Just because something may already work somewhat decently doesn't mean it can't still be improved. This way of thinking, of calling the authority of past sources and high officials into question, would start to become the dominant way of thinking around the world for the next few hundred years, indirectly starting many numerous revolutions all across the planet. If you want to learn more about some
Okay, so what did we find out there? We found out that the church was not happy with these new teachings because it made them look like they didn't know what they were talking about. So they would put people, I'm sorry, like Copernicus or Galileo on trial. They would kill people for different thought, but slowly more and more people were able to find out other things about the universe. And as they said in the video, why did it matter? Well, the church felt that if they were wrong about that, people were going to question other things, okay? Other things that they were teaching. So the scientific revolution brought a lot of new ideas and also was able to show people what really was happening. Now, in 2 videos before, they talked a little bit about the spice trade. Spices were very important back in those times. They didn't have refrigeration and there were harder ways to store meat. For instance, they could dry it and salt it and keep it for a longer time, but they needed salt. Things started to go bad, but people didn't have a lot of food, so they would season the meat and cover up the bad taste of the food with spices. Again, today, everyone has spices in their home. We don't think that much of them. Some of them are more expensive than others, but pretty much affordable for most people. However, the spice trade was very lucrative. It was a way to make a lot of money. And so the Spice Islands were the East Indies, present-day Indonesia, New Guinea, and India. And this is where the merchants would want people to go and bring these spices back. They cost just a little bit when they first get there. Then the people who get them and bring them back raise the amount up even very, very high. And then those who are selling it to the everyday people and people who want them raise it even higher. So spices are like gold. The Muslim and Arabs trade spices with the Italians, okay? They're the ones that have a lot of the spices and they sell them. Then the Italian traveler goes and gets the spices and he goes to the Mediterranean area and he goes, spices for sale, and he raises the price up 40 times what he made. Now, of course, he's got to pay for his ship or his caravan that he's used to bring the spice back. And, you know, he's risking his life. So, all right, some increase, but 40 times what he paid. Once the spices get from there, they go to Spain and Portugal and to other areas, and the spices are even increased more. Well, the rulers of Spain and Portugal begin to think that there must be another trade route, a shorter, more easier trade route to the Spice Islands and the Spice areas so that they can get more of this and get more money. Now, you all know the story of Christopher Columbus. He goes and he contacts the king, and the king of Spain says, not interested. Columbus says, I think that if I sail going west, I can get to the east, and that will be a shorter route, and I'm pretty sure I can do it. Now, remember, at this time, people were still learning about the earth, and yeah, you heard about, many people believed that the earth was flat, and they laughed at Christopher Columbus because they thought he was going to sail to the end of the earth and drop off. But others realized that that was not really the case. So Queen Isabella of Portugal commissions Columbus to sail, and he thinks that he does get to the Indies. He does, and he lands in North America. But that was a search to get spices and continue the spice trade. So I want to see if I have, yeah, I want to share this with you about the spice trade, okay?
When I was a student, I'd write long essays that I'd work on for days, but now I'm writing short emails and messages.
Average tariff of the Italian merchants told most of the trade in European outside of Italy wanted to access their own spices. Prince Henry encouraged Portuguese sea exploration, and he believed that Africa was the source of riches. Muslim traders to be controlled. He also hoped to reach Asia by going along the African coast. Cartographers prepared maps for the voyage. They were map makers. 1497, Vasco da Gama led 4 Portuguese ships around the southern tip of Africa. Eventually, he reached the spice port of Calicut in the west coast of India. Soon, the Portuguese seized ports around the Indian Ocean and created a vast trading empire. Now, others looked for a route to Asia. The Italian navigator Christopher Columbus Bella of Spain to sorry, I might have said she was before. Columbus sailed west with 3 small ships. When the crew finally spotted land, they thought they had reached the Indies or Southeast Asia. But what he found was unknown land, obviously North America. Spanish rulers asked Spanish Port Hope Alexander to support their authority or power, claim land on this. Spanish Port Hope Alexander to support their authority or power to claim on this. Okay? So the Pope sets a line of demarcation, a dividing line, right west of the line, and Portugal the rights to land east of the line. Both countries agreed to the term. It still had not found a quick route to Asia. However, in 1500, Portuguese government bring intelligence west from Spain to find a way to east. In 1520, he found a passageway that the southern tip of South America, and the was killed along the way, but survivors of the circumnavigate the world, go completely around. Okay? So the last part of today's lecture is going to be about the African slave trade. So we know that ships are sailing all around looking for spices, and the slave trade was the transportation of slaves by traders to the Americas, okay? And people were sold as if they were really property. And it was called the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage was a part that existed from 1600 to 16th century to 19th century. And it was sort of a triangular way. And the Portuguese began kidnapping people from the west coast of Africa and trading them back to Europe, where they would be slaves and servants. And the slave trade made it possible to deliver more political growth because it was a source of free labor. Okay, and then the British and French were the main couriers of the African slaves. And this took place until the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 that stopped slave trade mainly in Britain. So we know about the slave trade. We talked about that when we were talking about, I did the class and we talked about discrimination and what was happening with that. So I don't know if I actually have that. Let me just look. Yeah, I do. And this is going to be the transatlantic slave trade. Hold on, I don't think that I'm sharing. Okay, let's see.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. And today, we're learning about the transatlantic slave trade, which spanned nearly 400 years from the late 15th century to the late 19th century. The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. In his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, scholar and civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois described the Atlantic slave trade as, quote, the most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history. And he didn't mean magnificent in a good way. I want to note up top that this episode will address some challenging topics, including sexual violence and images of extreme violence. We believe, however, it is important to discuss these ideas thoroughly so that we can fully grapple with the reality of U.S. history. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic and included many different destinations. It was named the Middle Passage because it was the second of 3 parts of what became known as the triangular trade. The first leg of the journey carried cargo like textiles, iron, alcohol, firearms, and gunpowder from Europe to Africa's western coast. When the ships reached the coast of Western Africa, the cargo was exchanged for people. From there, ships loaded with human beings made their way to the Americas, where the enslaved Africans were sold in exchange for goods like sugar and tobacco before the ships made their way back to Europe. It's estimated that over the course of the Middle Passage, 2 million African captives died, their bodies often tossed overboard. What some people might not know about the slave trade is that the vast majority of people did not actually go to the United States. In fact, far from it. Only about 5% of captured Africans were brought directly to what would eventually become the U.S. The largest proportion, around 41%, went to Brazil, while millions of others were scattered across islands in the Caribbean and South America. As we examine slavery in the United States, from its earliest moments when people were first taken from their homes, all the way through the end of the Civil War, it's important to lift up the narratives and accounts of enslaved people themselves, as they can provide us with a perspective on this horrific institution in ways that few other documents can. For example, Olaudah Equiano, an African captured as a boy, wrote in his 1789 autobiography the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano about the experience of being captured and taken to the edge of the ocean and being boarded onto the ship. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew. And I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions, too differing so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. When I looked round the ship too, and saw a large furnace or copper boiling, and a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted of my fate, and, quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted. Captured Africans didn't really have an understanding of what lay ahead for them. Enslaved Africans weren't coming back to Africa from the Americas and warning people about what happened. All people knew was what they saw in front of them: a large ship, an endless ocean, and for many of these Africans, people speaking a language they had never heard, with a color skin some of them had never seen. It's also important to note that the story is not as simple as Africans being hunted and captured by Europeans and forced onto ships against their will. The Africans who were taken and placed on board these ships were typically prisoners of war from other African tribes, people deemed criminals, and poor members of society who were often traded to pay off their debt. Which is to say, many captured Africans were sold to Europeans by other Africans for a range of different goods. Now, this fact can sometimes be used in bad faith to obfuscate the horrors of what the Europeans did. And while it's important not to ignore the fact that there were Africans trading other Africans into bondage, we should remember that being a prisoner of war or a poor member of society traded for goods is not the same thing as being held in intergenerational, hereditary chattel slavery that meant your children and their children and their children would all be born into bondage. That is something unique to the experience of slavery in the Americas. As the scholar Orlando Patterson has written, slavery is the permanent, violent, and personal domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. You've likely heard about how horrible the conditions were on slave ships, but it's worth naming explicitly. The conditions on these ships were horrific. People were packed by the hundreds alongside one another, chained down, unable to move. The captured Africans were forced to relieve themselves in the same places where they slept, sat, and ate. As a result, the stench from the bottom of the ship, where there was little ventilation, was unbearable. Disease was rampant. From yellow fever to malaria, from smallpox to dysentery, it is difficult to capture how abhorrent the conditions were. To imagine this, it is helpful to hear from Equiano again. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that, with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, being so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. Violence against captured Africans was a devastating yet ubiquitous phenomenon as these ships crossed the Atlantic. In an effort to keep people submissive over the course of their several weeks-long trip, enslaved Africans were tortured in a variety of cruel, just unimaginable ways. Sexual violence was a common fixture as well. It was not uncommon for sailors to rape enslaved women while they were on board. But enslaved people didn't just passively accept the conditions that had been thrust onto them. They resisted in a myriad of ways. Some of these ways were individual, and some of them were collective. All of them were attempts to reclaim some sense of agency and control in just inconceivable circumstances. Sometimes they were as explicit as staging revolts meant to overthrow the crew. And sometimes they included individual acts of resistance, like refusing to eat or jumping overboard. Now, the idea of trying to take one's own life might seem like a strange sort of resistance to some. But what you have to consider is that these captured Africans represented money, like real money, to those who were holding them in chains on these ships.
So from that video, you did get a very clear depiction of the horrors of what the African slave trade was like, the Atlantic slave trade, and how it started from Europe and came down with goods, where they traded the goods for people, and then they sailed across to North and South America. with the largest number of African Americans purchased in an area of Brazil, but also in the Indies and the islands there, and then going up to North America. So today we talked about a span of years that started from the end of the Middle Ages with the Renaissance, and then a change with religion through the Protestant Reformation, and also a change in the way people thought about the world and science with the development of telescopes, and for people who are in this Reformation movement, this humanistic movement, who are now beginning to look at the human body. And in the video that we looked at, they had a picture of what they thought was inside the human body, but they never thought of looking inside. So people began to do dissections to learn about various organs and how things worked. So that would make a difference. Remember, many times people believed if they took some herb, which many times had some could help you, that would make you better, but they didn't know really how so many parts of the body worked. So this Reformation and this scientific enlightenment all began to change how the world thought and looked at things, how the world put value on certain things, how the world puts less value on human life at certain points. So that's the end of today's lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it. Get outside this week. I believe that the weather is going to be beautiful, and enjoy yourself. Again, if you have not taken your midterm exam, do it. Okay, and make sure that you get that out of the way. And I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.